Hi, you're listening to Unfiltered, real talk about sex and love with Ashley
and Heather. And on today's episode, we are going to be talking about the dark details of sexual fantasy. We actually get a lot of questions about fantasy and the role that it plays in recovery and healing. And so let's jump in.
All right. Our first question is, I'm in a Betrayal Beyond group and my husband is in a 7 Pillars group. We are working through the painful process. I'm curious about what specifically men are seeking out that they are not being provided with by their partners. Are we talking about specific acts, positions, role playing? I would love to understand what makes pornography better than me. I really think even if people don't verbalize this question, betrayed spouses think it. Like, what am I not providing that they want? And I really want you to speak to... it's not tolerance, but like when escalation or whatever after this, like just the brain, like what they're looking at is not necessarily maybe where they even started, which was my husband's case. And I totally can empathize with this woman because when I found out about John's addiction, I was like, all my insecurities, you know, having twins, 4 children, being a stay-at-home mom, everything that I was insecure about with my body just rose to the surface. Like I felt so humiliated and embarrassed and ashamed and wanted to just cover my body. And then I started asking him, I did not have a group and I did not have an Ashley and Heather to tell me not to do this. I do not advise doing this at home. But back then I asked him, I said, what is it that you look at that I don't give you? And he was like, I don't want to tell you this. And I'm like, no, I need to know. When you go to the computer and you type in, what exactly are you typing in? And it was so not good for my mental health at all. It was not good. It wasn't helpful information. And so we tell a betrayed spouse, you're free to ask whatever you want. If you need there to be no secrets, you can ask those things. And we've done this long enough to know that there are questions that are helpful to your recovery and questions that are not helpful. Because when we say that sexual acting out and sexual addiction is not about sex, and it's not because of anything you're lacking or doing, it's their own cause, their own thing, their own patterns, arousal template that cause that, we mean it. And so having knowing what they're looking at is not going to give you answers to anything. It's not going to fix any solutions because that's not at the core what the problem is. It's not, oh, you need to wear more lingerie or you need to do more of these positions and everything would be better. That's not it at all. It's probably some intimacy attachment disorder at the bottom that's playing out in these ways, and then there's been patterns developed or trauma attached to sexual experiences or all kinds of things that could have them looking at things. And so I would not suggest asking those things because then you have to be out in the world visually triggered by all of these things, feeling like a fraud in bed if you don't act these things out, or if you do act them out, you feel like a fraud, like you're just playing this pretend role and it's not actually you. But at the same time, it's very understandable to want to know what it is that your husband is looking at, because it doesn't make sense that it's not about us, but it truly is their own thing. So maybe you can talk to like arousal template and what they get into and how that can escalate into something different.
Yeah. And I think that when we say that it's not about the partner, it's really the same. If you could like step out of that whole scenario for a minute and recognize that usually these kind of behaviors start in childhood and something has happened that's been traumatic, and you'll have some children who go to pornography, you have some children that go to food, you have some children that go to video games, you know what I mean? There's all these different options that somebody could choose to make themselves feel better. And so it just is unfortunate. All of the things are unfortunate, but when it comes to pornography and the way that it makes partners feel, it is one of those things that her phrase about saying, what is it that makes pornography better than me? I think is heartbreaking for one thing, but it also is just recognizing that a lot of times people will start by and I don't know sometimes if it's intentional or accidentally that they stumble across something and then they end up pursuing that and they end up at a porn site or something, but they might initially start looking at, images with people that have clothes on, but it's just like, maybe just there's a suggestion there. And then at some point, because of the way that at first that's exciting and their brain is releasing all of this dopamine, and it in the moment it makes them feel good, and their brain, because our brain is so powerful, that our brain says, I want to feel that again. So I'm going to remember that when I feel depressed or when I feel anxiety or when I feel rejected, then this is going to be my solution, that they're going to keep going back to that. But because they're overstimulating the production of dopamine in their brain through these images, our brain is then going to naturally decrease the amount of dopamine because it already recognizes that we have way too much dopamine. But then that image is not going to give the same effect. And so this is why you sometimes, for people who've looked at pornography for years and years and years, they may have started in something that was like soft pornography, and now they're looking at child porn. And that didn't happen overnight.
Right.
It's something that at one point, looking at this image gave their brain the response that they were looking for, but over time, it's not going to work anymore. And so then they're going to continue to find something that is going to give them that big hit of dopamine that they got the first time, which honestly, they're probably never going to find it again unless they do something that is so taboo or, anything. But you find people who, even we've heard from people in group that they're looking at gay porn, but they're not gay, but it's because at some point the pornography that they were looking at stopped working. And so they had to go to something different, something more exciting, something more, and so I think that is part of recognizing that not only is sex addiction not about the partner, because it has this long history and almost this life of its own that has progressed over time. But I think that it isn't that phrase that it's better than me is such a myth and that is the wrong mindset to have about this. Because what really is that for your spouse, it is something that he is doing to himself that is harming him in the worst imaginable way, which then is harming you, and it's not better than you. It's not, it's toxic and it's harmful, and it will take lifelong change to undo the damage that pornography does. And so, but again, when we're in the midst of betrayal, this is a hard message to hear. And it's even a harder message to actually get in there, to start reframing our mindset around it, to say, this is not about me. This is on him. This is, but that's a hard thing. And sometimes it can be what they're looking at. It could be positions. It could be things like, body type and hairstyle. It could be something like the way that an image is dressed. Sometimes you'll hear different things about, men seeking out specifically girls in Catholic schoolgirl, uniforms. Right? That's not pornography, but for them, it could be tied to their arousal template, which then would lead them to something that's more harmful. And so even like you said, finding out this information is not going to be helpful to the partner. It might not even make sense to the partner because it has a life and a history all its own.
Yeah. And I love that you use the word myth, because we do, as betrayed spouses, I want to validate that we feel like you're seeking something that I can't give you.
Right.
But what would be helpful is understanding for the spouse to understand. And then this is maybe something the betrayed spouse can hear, is why I seek those things out. We'll have guys seek out porn that's actually attached to their trauma. They may want porn with a woman who is older or dominant or pursues them because there was a lack of that growing up. They missed a mother figure, or maybe they had a domineering mother figure. Sometimes we talk about how you either run away from or repeat your trauma, and so that can play out in the fantasies that you have. And so really maybe not so much about exactly what does it look like that they're looking at, but going back to understand the reason why I seek these types of porn out, or this type of affair partner out, is because of it's attached to this experience, this trauma, trying to meet this need in an illegitimate way.
Right. Yeah. Which is all stuff that is going on in a person's brain. Yeah. Yep. So our next question says, part of my addicted spouse's acting out is using me for sex. When it appears he's doing work and not using pornography, fantasy, and masturbation, sex is back in the picture. He goes to cruise control and stops doing his recovery work. Then I feel unsafe, uncared for, and used, and he gets upset, and the cycle starts all over again. What would you advise? I think that my first advice would be to try and figure out how to break that cycle.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, and if I remember right from her story, because she gave us quite a bit of backstory on this one, that this seems to be something that when he says he's not using pornography or masturbation or fantasy, and yet he's more like white knuckling it and then relapses. And so that is another part of this cycle. But I think that what it would be helpful for her is to figure out how to break that cycle.
Yeah.
And because it sounds like that when he's doing his work, that really the reward for him doing his work is for them to be able to have sex again. And then he stops doing his recovery work.
Yeah.
Which that's not true recovery.
Yeah.
And so I would probably also recommend that if they have not done, for sure, being involved in groups, possibly counseling, but even to take sex off the table for 90 days, which is often recommended during the recovery and healing process, because it then will help to disrupt that expectation, disrupt what's happening in the brain, so that then she has a bit of a reprieve to feel safe, and he can then allow his dopamine levels to go back to something more normal, where he's not like overly inflating his dopamine levels, and kind of give them an opportunity to reset. That would be probably part of my recommendation as well.
Yeah, you really have to just put the whole thing in. I mean, if this has been a pattern, like you said, disrupting it, is their recovery work being done consistently? Are they in group? Are they making calls, connecting with other healthy men and accountability, support people, counseling, do the whole thing? And I remember telling John, like, this is like antibiotics. You're not going to just stop taking them after a few days because you're feeling better, because then we can have worse problems down the road. You're going to do the whole course, because we want to make sure that there's that longevity. And so, we've showed charts in our conferences where it's like, okay, the sincerity is there. That they feel remorseful in the beginning. And then there's sincerity, ability. They do group, they're in counseling. But then the hard part is going all the way to durability and seeing those things, sincerity and the ability. So showing that he's remorseful, willing to do the work, wanting to change, showing that actually doing it, but then over a long period of time. And it sounds like there's kind of this stopping point after he's shown remorse, done a little work, and then it's like, okay, why aren't we back to normal? Why aren't you trusting me again? And she's needing to see it over time. And John and I got stuck there too. And I remember explaining to him, we just need to keep doing this until we are truly like reset to a new normal and have a new level of trust built, and we're both there, because one of us can get there a little sooner, and we need to be patient with the other person, usually the betrayed spouse, and take the time that it needs for that spouse to get back to trusting and feeling safe again.
And it seems like in this one, I remember reading that this has been a pervasive pattern in their relationship as long as they've been in recovery, maybe for the last 2 or 3 years. And so I think also working with a counselor who specializes, both of them going to a counselor who specializes in sex addiction and betrayal trauma, and getting an outside perspective probably would be helpful in order to break this cycle.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, our next question is, although my husband is not engaging in porn or masturbation, he does engage in flashes and fantasy while having sex with me. He says this is not breaking his sobriety, and according to our counselor, it is. I feel violated, used, and betrayed. Can you help me understand more about the issues of flashes and fantasy? As far as the struggling spouse, the addict spouse having flashes and fantasy during sex, it's the same. You still need to stop. Like, both sides, whether it's the betrayed spouse or the addict spouse, if this is happening while you're having sex, pause. You need to both be willing to pause and not have that be not push through and have sex while these different mental images are going on in either brain, in his brain, in this question, because that just is going to continue to like strengthen that pattern and that connection. And some of the things that you can do to change that are stop, bring it back, get his mind out of fantasy, back to the present, and then move forward if you can. If he can't get out of that fantasy and it keeps happening, you might just need to stop for the night and try again tomorrow. Have him be looking at and thinking about like, what is his daytime looking like? Or is it just, the trigger of having sex is making those flashes come back? This is why having a light on is so important, because it's easy to just like play the visual images in your head if there's nothing to visually see in front of you. And so having a light on is so important, even if it's a low light, and looking at each other. And so maybe, certain positions where you're not seeing eye to eye contact needs to come off the table. Like, you need to be able to see each other. You need to be able to have a visual. You need to be able to be present and then pause during those flashes. And, no, I don't necessarily know, like, without knowing him and his pattern and his recovery work, if this means his sobriety is broken, because mental images and flashes and fantasy can just come like a freight train. I mean, it's like your brain has been programmed to see these things and think so long that it does take a while for them to kind of go away. But even in somebody who's had really good recovery, you could come across something and then have these visual images pop into your brain. And so, if he's taking these images and like entertaining them and acting out to them, that's different. But fantasies really, I think they do mirror the work you're doing during the day. So like mentally lassoing those thoughts and putting them down and taking those thoughts captive. And as a betrayed spouse, I remember thinking of it as like one of those old movie film reels. Like I could feel it coming, that I was going to go down a rabbit hole of imagining all the things John was looking at, and I would have to be like, no. And I like would see it back here and be like, no, I'm not going to entertain these thoughts, and mentally have to go think about something else. And it's tiring. And in the beginning, it feels like you're doing that all the time. You're spending all this energy lassoing those thoughts and taking them captive. And then it starts to get a little easier, but do it in the moment and don't let it run away, because then it just gets harder.
Yeah. And another thing too is that if this is something that you can do where you can actually spend the day together, where it's not one of those situations where he's at work all day, you're at work all day, you're coming together, but that you could be super intentional about re-engaging in sex, but even set it up so that you're doing things together in the day so that you're feeling so much more connected, then that might help as well. But definitely with the lights on, facing each other, those are things that we recommend often for women who are in this situation.
Thank you for joining this conversation today about fantasy. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with your friends, subscribe. If you can think it, we should be talking about it. And please send us your questions to unfiltered@puredesire.org, because we want to hear from you. And these are your questions that we're answering. So if you have a question, go ahead and send it to us, unfiltered@puredesire.org.